In today's video, I'm going to give you a very simple way of viewing mental health that will completely transform the way you view your own mental health so you can know exactly what changes need to be made to improve it. Hi and welcome back to Mental Health Power. So I know this might sound like a very simple question, but I think it's something that is fundamental and really needs to be understood because yes, mental health is spoken about more widely now than it used to be, which is great. But I still think on a very fundamental level, mental health is still massively misunderstood, which is why there are still so many mental health issues that are even increasing now. So I'm going to show you how I view mental health. And I think by understanding in this way, it can change not only the way you see yourself if you have mental health issues, but also the way you see other people as well. But also it will help you to see how mental health is something that everyone has, and it's not about what problems you could have, but when you'll have problems. In the same way that it's not about whether you have physical health or not, you have physical health, and it's about knowing what to do if you get a physical health problem. So if we carry on with this analogy of the body, the mind. So you could say there are three major parts to us: body, mind, and emotions. So to understand what mental health is, which is also connected to our emotional health, let's just have a very basic understanding of what physical health is. So we can say that someone who's in good physical health is experiencing physical harmony. So their body is functioning as you'd expect, and it's working fine. They're not experiencing any emotional pain. But specifically, let's say that somebody let's say someone shoots an arrow into their knee, okay? We would call this a physical trauma, right? And then doctors, professionals, medical professionals are going to have to do some work on it. So they're going to have to remove the cause of the trauma, so the arrow, and then there are going to be wounds left, and there's going to be all other kinds of physical issues. So then they're going to have to take action to help the body to recover. So they're going to have to, clean the wound, stitch it up, do all kinds of things, and then they leave the body to recover. The person may have to go through some kind of physiotherapy, maybe, because maybe the muscles now have changed the way they work temporarily because of the injury. So there'll be some work to do, but it's entirely possible and highly probable that they will recover from that because we have good medical understanding generally in this part of the world. So that's a physical trauma. And we can also say the other way that this physical harmony could be disrupted is through physical stress. So if somebody's carrying 70 kilograms on their shoulders, even the most strongest person will eventually find this 70 kilograms to be too much to carry. Eventually, because their body has limits, they'll experience pain. And their body is saying, look, there's something here we need to get rid of now. It's creating problems. So because now there's disharmony being created with the 70 kilograms they're carrying, this physical stress, then their body's going to react in a certain way. So to change the experience of physical pain, they're going to remove the 70 kilograms. Now their body can relax because the cause of the physical stress is gone. That's simple, very basic explanation of physical health, when it's good and when it's bad. So if we use that same analogy to understand mental emotional health, we find it's exactly the same. So while we can't shoot physical arrows into the mind, because I guess we can see the mind as being non-tangible, then if somebody experiences psychological trauma, that's exactly the same concept. It's like having an arrow shot into your mind, so you'll experience some kind of psychological trauma, as in pain. Because of this, then in the same way the body has all other kind of symptoms come up, psychologically, they're going to have all kind of symptoms coming up. So this is often where depression can come, anxiety, depersonalisation, like in my previous videos I explained I had that for 10 years. Addictions can come from this. All manner of issues can stem because of this metaphorical trauma arrow. Usually this arrow could be from childhood, like let's say someone's witnessed a traumatic event, for example. People may have multiple arrows as well. And so because of that, the same principle. So their mind is going to try to find ways to warn the person. And so usually people will go for things like therapy, or they'll do other kinds of self-help. To understand, so that's to understand psychological trauma. To understand psychological stress, well, metaphorically speaking, in the same way that the body has physical limits to how much it can carry, the load it can carry, there's a limit to how much mentally we can carry as well. And so let's say that someone's carrying the equivalent of 100 kilograms of stress every day. That's going to be extremely painful psychologically, right? And so there are going to be different ways that the mind's going to change. Their behavior is going to change. They'll feel differently as well. And so imagine if somebody has, so usually what happens is somebody will have this kind of trauma, psychological trauma, and then stress comes about from it because now the mind is weakened. In the same way, if somebody was walking around with an arrow in their knee, it's going to feel like carrying basic stuff, doing basic stuff is going to be much more difficult. That's what it's like with psychological issues. And then you'll obviously experience, let's say someone's experienced also emotional pain. So usually these are both directly connected. All of them are connected, but it's more obvious to see how the mind and emotions are connected. So if someone's carrying, again, the equivalent of 100 kilograms of emotional pain, and they've probably, and let's say they've experienced emotional trauma as well, from let's say relationships, or again from the psychological trauma they've experienced or witnessing something, this is going to be painful. And so of course that stress and the disharmony that was experienced is gone now. So there was psychological harmony, there was emotional harmony. Now the stress and the traumas have disrupted that. So you're going to get symptoms coming up, just as you would physically. So why is this important to understand? It's important because it's easy for us to understand what good physical health is. That's why we recognize usually very quickly, oh, I need to go to the doctor, or I need to get something to help me because my body is telling me there's a problem. But we don't readily recognize psychological and emotional symptoms as well. Unless it's really over the top, then it's obvious. And so I think this is important because when we look at things in this way, having mental health issues and understanding your own emotions becomes much more simple. Because I know as a society they're referred to as mental health disorders, but when you see it in this way, there's nothing wrong, because the word disorder often can make people think there's something wrong with them. But really, in the same way how the body would have to temporarily adapt to the stress or to the physical trauma, the mind and emotions will find ways to adapt to the mental and emotional, physical stress and trauma. So a lot of the symptoms people experience psychologically, emotionally are adaptations. It's nothing wrong has occurred. It's simply adapting to stresses and traumas. And so this can transform the way you see your own mental health issues or someone else. Because often we can end up thinking that we've done something wrong or there's something wrong with us, but no, it's not your fault. You've just experienced at some point one of these trauma arrows and the emotional psychological stress. And so you can see how on a wider scale this is a problem, because generally speaking, yes, we as a society generally understand our physical health needs. So in this case, if someone gets an arrow in their knee or they're carrying too much, they know what they need to recover, to take off the physical stress, or to take out the arrow, the trauma, to let it go, to take it out, and then the doctors will know exactly what to do so that the body can recover. Because the doctors don't actually make the body recover, right? They just create the environment so that the body, the biology can heal itself. And so it's the same with the mind and emotions. The problem is that we readily recognize this aspect. We don't readily recognize these two. So yes, okay, there is still a lot of good information and generally good understanding about the brain and the mind. But the problem is, because things like the subconscious mind and its importance isn't really mentioned, and because there is still a lack of understanding of how important our own thoughts are, I think that really only half of this aspect is really understood. And I still think as a society, we don't really understand our own emotions. And that's why people turn to things like coping mechanisms. So they can have this stress and these traumas, and then we have not been taught as a society what we need to do to recover. People don't generally know what their actual emotional, psychological needs are, especially if they've got these issues going on. So if you have a society that doesn't recognize these, it's no wonder that there are so many problems and psychological issues rising over time. And so really, once we understand things in this way, then we can start to ask ourselves questions so that we can start recovery. So first question to ask is, what stresses do you currently have and have had recently? Psychologically, physically, mentally. What traumas have you experienced physically, mentally, emotionally? And then the other question to ask is, what has it taken away and what needs to be let go of, or what needs need to be met? What psychological or emotional needs need to be met? And if you're not sure, then the bigger question is, what are your psychological and emotional needs? Because when you give your body, your mind, your emotions what they need, and you remove what's creating disharmony, that's how recovery starts. And after asking about what your needs are, you have to look at understanding, are there any ways I'm trying to meet my psychological, emotional, and physical needs, but I'm doing it in an unhealthy way? Because often we can think we're getting along fine and we have good mental health. But if you look carefully, you may be using coping mechanisms. Maybe, for example, you have a severe lack of energy unless you're drinking fizzy drinks, unless you're drinking coffee. Or maybe like for me, for example, I used to think, oh yeah, everything's cool, everything's fine. And then you realize, well, it's because I'm distracting myself with video games. Like that's what I used to do in the past. I did a whole video about video game addiction, how I overcame it as well. So then these issues become much easier to understand once you see things in this way. And once you understand that we have limits, physical and mental as well as emotional. And if these limits are broken, yeah, we're going to get symptoms. And then, of course, we have to understand that these are adaptations. It's a lot more accurate to see these as adaptations, because then it's a question of not how do I fix myself, which is a really negative belief people can have. It's how do I rebalance things out? How do I integrate things? How do I remove things that are creating disharmony? How do I create harmony? I think that shift in mindset absolutely changed everything for me, and is, I believe, the core reason why I was able to recover from many mental health issues. Because I didn't see the psychological issues I had as disorders. Initially I did. I saw them as adaptations. Because if you think about it, let's say, so we do a lot of sitting down these days, right? And because of this unfortunate normality of having to sit down at work a lot, for example. You don't have to, obviously there are standing desks and other alternatives, but most people don't use that. They sit down a lot, even outside of work. And so there are certain physical issues that are coming up, like I'm sure you've heard of phone neck or nerd neck, they call it, where people's spines have changed slightly, so their neck is now facing forward more because of using the phone so much, or because people are sitting down so much. There's something called anterior pelvic tilt, where I used to have this, I had to work on it, where your spine is slightly moved forward. That is a physical adaptation to a physical stress. It's just such a almost invisible one that it's almost unnoticeable until you notice the physical symptoms. Because you see there was physical harmony, let's say in the bone and muscle structure, and then that has been slightly disrupted over time by a certain amount of physical stress that's been experienced every single day. So once you remove the object of the stress, the physical stress, and then you work on certain exercises to correct it, then you've restored harmony. Because the body does have limits. There are certain things it doesn't want to do, and so it will adapt. The mind and your emotions are exactly the same. So your mind will look for ways to adapt to these traumas and these stresses, and it comes out in behaviors that we often find hard to understand. So addictions, coping mechanisms, ways to distract ourselves are ways that we use to deal with these stresses and traumas we've experienced, because unfortunately, I don't think that enough people in society actually view mental health in this way. And so, yes, we have an understanding of the body pretty much, more or less extremely well. I still think there's not enough focus on nutrition, but that's another series. That's another series of videos entirely. But generally speaking, yeah, we understand the body. And so by asking yourself these questions and by viewing mental health in this way, in a more holistic way, this can completely transform the way you see yourself, any issues you have, and how you approach your mental health. So if you have a psychological disorder, as it's been called, if you're having emotional issues that are referred to as a disorder, just think, is it really just an adaptation to traumas and stresses you've experienced? Just something to think about. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.